The Man Crow. In a remote town in New England, where the darkness of the night was especially thick, it seemed as though the town itself hid more secrets than it could bear. In this town, deep in the forest, lived a man who was feared and avoided by everyone, but almost no one dared to speak of him aloud. His name was Edward. He was a recluse who spent most of his time in an old house surrounded by dense trees. Edward had once been an ordinary man, but everything changed after he was involved in a terrible accident in the forest, where, according to rumors, all his relatives perished. Since that moment, he disappeared from human sight, and rumors began to spread that something strange, terrifying, and unnatural had happened to him. One night, when the wind was tearing the last autumn leaves from the trees and the full moon brightly shone in the sky, a group of teenagers decided to uncover the truth about Edward. They approached his house, where the ground was full of old moss-covered graves. The windows were boarded up, but through the cracks, faint light still seeped through. The boys walked to the door, laughing and excited by the adrenaline, but a growing sense of fear began to build. One of them, the most determined, was about to knock on the door when suddenly they heard a strange sound, a hoarse cawing. It was the caw of a raven, or perhaps something worse, something unholy, meant to shock them. Suddenly, one of the girls let out a muffled scream and stepped away from the door. In the darkness, a figure appeared that resembled a man, but it looked entirely inhuman. Its face was disfigured, resembling that of a bird, with terrifying black eyes that mercilessly stared into the soul of anyone who met their gaze. Its clothes were torn, and its body seemed partially covered in feathers. As it approached, the darkness grew even thicker, as if it were absorbing all the light around. The group had no time to think. They ran through the forest, but strange footsteps followed them. Every time they looked back, they saw only a dark figure in the distance, followed by the dreadful cawing of a raven, growing nearer. They ran deeper into the forest, but soon they felt as though another reality was entwining around them. They moved through this world, but the forest seemed endless, and time and space became tangled. They were trapped, as if caught in a labyrinth with no exit. But they didn't know that this was only the beginning of their terrifying experience. Soon after escaping the forest, they realized they had become part of its curse. Time passed, and each of them began to lose touch with reality. They saw images, the same horrifying cawing of the raven, which seeped into their dreams, faces of people they no longer recognized. And all of this was accompanied by a constant feeling that someone or something was watching them. One day, one of the boys, who was in the worst state, told the others that he had seen Edward, the man they once knew. But this was not just a man. It was a shadow into which Edward had transformed, gathering within himself the parts of all the enemies he had once destroyed. He had become the very monster that made people suffer from fear and pain that never ceased. A man who could no longer distinguish himself from the monster had become the embodiment of all the horrifying moments they had endured. None of the teenagers ever returned home. They were all consumed by the forest, and only some traces remained among those who continued to fear the night and hide from the horrors that emerged from the darkness. Only the old people who had once known Edward whispered that he had transformed into the raven-like entity that possessed eternal power. He hunted those who dared approach his cursed home. To this day, it is said that those who wander into the forest never return. If you go there and hear the caw of a raven, know this: you are standing at the border between the world of the living and those who have already become part of this dark entity. But nothing stops you from trying, because with every step you take, you only get closer to its power. Several years passed since the group of teenagers disappeared in the forest. But strange events began to happen in the town. Legends about Edward and his transformation into the Man Crow became even more real. Rumors spread, and more people started to feel his presence. Some saw him in their dreams, others in mirrors. Some even heard his caw in the night silence, as if the forest itself were waking up, like a living organism, repeatedly taking the souls of those who dared look into its dark depths. One winter evening, when the snow covered the ground with a thick layer, a stranger appeared in the town. His name was James. He was a researcher of myths and ancient legends, and after learning about the tragedy of the teenagers, he decided to unravel the mystery that at first seemed to him only a fabrication. His intuition told him that it was connected to some ancient ritual that gave a person the power to transform into something more than human, into a monster that lived in the darkness. James ventured into the forest, knowing it would be dangerous. He followed the ancient instructions he found in old manuscripts. He believed that unraveling the curse could only be achieved through knowledge gained from the feelings experienced in the forest and through magical symbols, which, according to old legends, could stop the transformation. But he did not know that his investigation would lead to the unimaginable. Just a few hours into the forest, it seemed to him that he was not alone. It felt as though someone or something was following him. And then, in the mist, a figure appeared again, a form with a face covered in feathers. It was him, the man-crow. James lost the ability to think. His heart stopped in terror, but he did not stop. He kept walking, knowing that his only hope was to find the symbols and complete the ritual. As soon as James reached the heart of the forest, where the trees stood intertwined, he saw an old stone with a symbol carved into it. It was a seal that, according to the old manuscripts, could stop the curse. He stood before it, recited the words he had heard from the elders, and suddenly felt the air change. The forest seemed to quiet. And then the cawing again. It didn't fade. James tried to hold on, but something in his heart told him that the ritual would not end well. He felt that the power of this entity was overwhelming. And then the unimaginable happened. The man-crow shed his human form. He appeared before James as a massive black figure, covering the sky with his wings. These wings were not just feathers. They seemed alive, heavy, some unseen terror, aiming to consume everything. Only now did James realize that he had not entered the forest, but rather the very depths of a dark reality, where his soul had become part of this force. "You don't understand why I exist," the voice of the man-crow intoned, sounding both human and unclean. "I am not just a curse. I am part of this world. I am the forgotten shadow that devours souls, and you, like all who have come to me, will become part of my essence." James tried to run, but in that moment, he felt the ground beneath him start to shift, and the forest once again became endless, just as it had been for those teenagers who lost their grip on reality. And here, he understood that perhaps all this was just the beginning. The man-crow did not merely hunt souls. He created an endless cycle, where every new soul that fell into his trap became another piece of this eternal darkness. Those who survived his curse could not escape. Their souls were trapped in the forest, always feeling his presence, and now James was one of them. And as he felt, this was just the beginning for those who entered here, into this endless otherworld. James couldn't believe what had happened to him. The forest, which he had once considered a strange and terrifying place, now revealed itself to be merely the threshold to something far darker and more horrifying. He stood at the edge of two worlds, the world of the living and the one stretching out before him. The forest receded, and in its place appeared another, almost abstract space, an endless darkness that consumed everything around him. There was no sky, no ground, no time. Only gloom and emptiness, where shadows moved and whispers lingered. This world was not merely a place. It was a reality that existed beyond comprehension. The usual laws of physics did not apply here. Stones appeared under James's feet, engraved with strange, non-existent symbols. These were seals that contained both known and unknown forces. And in this darkness, he felt his own form dissolve, his body becoming blurry, as though his own essence, like the shadows that moved, had no defined shape. "You are not here to return," the same grim croak sounded again, coming from the man-crow, now tangled with echoes bouncing off each shadow surrounding him. James turned, and a chill ran through his entire body. He saw the massive black figure, larger than when he had seen it in the forest. It emerged from the darkness, its eyes burning with red fire, and the black feathers on its back shimmered, as if they were infinitely sharp and all-consuming. "This is a world with no time, no beginning and no end," the man-crow said. Its voice resonated from the abyss, as if it were part of this darkness, its very essence invisible, swallowed by this world. "You are no longer alive. You are one of us." James tried to speak, but words failed him. His speech became incomprehensible, even to himself. He no longer felt his heartbeat. His thoughts began to dissolve in this endless murk where the sense of time and reality had become arbitrary. The true horror came from the fact that there was no answer to the question of where he was or why this had happened. "You all come here," the man-crow continued, and its figure grew even larger. It moved closer, and each step of this monster shattered the space around James. Those who enter here never return. Their souls become part of us, part of my shadow. And all of you will eventually become birds, just like me. And then James felt something begin to change within him. It was not pain. It was a feeling of inevitability. His body, no longer his own, started to tremble. His skin covered in feathers, and he felt his very essence dissolve, becoming something higher and worse at the same time. He looked at his hands and saw them covered in black feathers that gleamed in the darkness, as if they were alive. You are now part of this shadow, the voice said, both human and inhuman, terrifying and harmonious. This is not merely an exchange, it's a bond. You can no longer distinguish reality from everything that came before. You are my servant. Your soul now belongs to me. Suddenly, he felt as though he had changed on every level, penetrating the afterworld where nothing familiar existed. Here even death had no meaning. All those who entered here became part of this world, trapped in an endless loop where their fears and horrors lived forever. James realized that this world did not just consume bodies, but souls, turning them into parts of the man-crow's very shadow. He began to fly. Now, he was no longer human, but part of these dark creatures. The crows flying around him were no longer just birds. They were souls that had entered the man-crow's domain, condemned to eternal existence in this shadow. Each of them was part of this cursed cycle, each a new servant to the man-crow. But over time, James began to feel that even in this world, there was room for despair. The shadows grew ever more real. His new sensations didn't seem as painful as before. Flying became his only essence, and he understood that this essence was merely a part of a larger cycle, where there would be no escape or salvation. The man-crow, no longer just a creature of darkness but of this entire world, was all-powerful. She was both part of every soul and the ruler of this abyss. She watched him, and every movement of his became her own. All who entered her web became part of her. You will never leave here, she said again. And you already know that everyone who steps into this world will never distinguish their dreams from this afterlife. And as James flew with the other shadows, he realized that he had been chosen, and that his fears had now become his strength. In this world, there was no exit, no salvation. It was an endless repetition, where all past victims had already become part of the man-crow, and now so had he. This world, this endless cycle, continued to exist, consuming new souls to make them part of the afterworld entity, where everyone became merely an element of the eternal shadow. And so James became one of the enemies of this world, ruled by the man-crow, and forever flying through the shadows of the afterworld, knowing he would never be the same again.